From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudler, and this matters. At least 4 people murdered. Multiple shooting incidents and over 50 arsons that include a law office and the burned out remains of tow trucks used as part of intimidation campaigns, extortion, and fraud. The GTA's tow truck turf wars are a years-long crime wave that continues unabated. While a number of highly publicized arrests occurred in last year's Project Platinum, which was led by York Region Police and saw 11 people arrested and a number of guns and drugs seized, the wars go on. In the past week, there have been more shootings and an arson. But even more importantly, a number of police officers have been charged with crimes like bribery and extortion, and more are under investigation. The Star's Peter Edwards has written extensively about organized crime and recently wrote about how this ongoing investigation has changed the command structure in 3 OPP detachments in the GTA. He joins us once again to give an update on the region's tow truck turf wars and how their scope is expanding into areas like corruption. Peter, thank you so much for joining us again on This Matters.
Thanks for having me. I enjoy it.
So Peter, the last time I had you on, it was right after Project Platinum. And that was the big York Region Police bust last year that tried to put a dent into the GTA's thriving tow truck turf war crime. Now, I want to talk about that bust, but there's been a bunch more crimes. So let's start with the update. First, there was some recent shootings and another burned out tow truck. So despite those high profile busts last year, this thing is just, well, trucking along, if you can pardon the pun, right?
Yeah, I mean, now when I have my morning coffee, I check to see if there's any shootings on the 401. I mean, it's just part of my morning ritual right now. And if there's a bit, then I have to decide, is it newsworthy or have we gotten a bit numb to it? And what's my standard for filing a story? Last week, we had someone in a Mercedes cruising down the 401 shooting at tow trucks. He didn't hit anybody, but he shot the trucks. We had a angry meeting between tow truck drivers. We had someone threatening, waving a gun around, but not actually shooting. This stuff is bubbling all the time.
There's also another burnt out tow truck. And I know arson has been something that these guys there's been involved in this last couple of years, right? Famously, there was a law firm, I believe, that was burned down, right?
Yeah, and the law firm was actually put out of business, which is pretty amazing. She had specialized in cases for insurance companies.
One of the lawyers was threatened at gunpoint. It was daylight. It was lunchtime. The plaza was completely full of cars. The gunman had said, "Stop suing my friend."
This is one of the few stories where we actually are quite sympathetic to the insurance companies. The tow truck last week, it was $150,000 damage. It was a brand new truck, and the person who owned that truck, his previous truck, had been burned out too. And so, pretty clearly he's being watched by bad folks.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously that's sort of the street level crime. In addition to the violence, I think more importantly, Peter, is you've reported on some police arrests and changes in how divisions are run as a result of the fallout from the bribery and corruption in this investigation. Can you please tell us a bit more about that?
The key thing, and this is what keeps me really pulled into this one, is you can't have organized crime without corruption. Like you just have bandits, you just have criminals. To have it organized and ongoing, it is kind of an ecosystem or an industry. You need corruption. So a week ago, we had 3 junior officers charged with taking bribes. One was charged with sexual bribes as well as money bribes, which is kind of an unusual charge. Also, there are 4 other officers, senior officers, who have been suspended, who are under investigation, and they include 2 inspectors and 2 sergeants. So that's quite high up the food chain.
So the 3 junior officers have been named. There are 4 who are suspended without pay, but they're more senior. And you were saying that that's creating a bit of a rift here, perhaps, in this investigation. Is it seem that perhaps the investigation so far is going after sort of the more low-hanging fruit? Is that fair to say?
I think that would be fair to say. And a lot of times when there's a scandal, senior people are allowed to quietly retire. Keep your pension, retire, tell us what you know. And the junior ones, even though they were junior in rank, they had been around for quite a while. The least experience was 20 years. If they were doing this, then either there's incompetence because they didn't know, or there's corruption because they're in on it. And stuff I'm hearing points more towards corruption.
Okay, so this is one of those things I remember. I believe there was one police officer charged in the initial Project Platinum thing. Do you think that this investigation is more going towards that corruption now, or is there still a lot of the low-level stuff that they also have to deal with as well?
I think if you got the corruption, the low-level stuff would stop. I mean, I think the corruption is why they're allowed to do it. Well, there's one Hell's Angel who's charged with dipping into computer databases and sort of knowing who lives where. That's Ministry of Transportation, but basically the same area. So yeah, I think you have to aim high. It's just that when you aim high, it gets embarrassing because all of a sudden you're starting to hit your friends, people you're close to, more people you're associated with.
I don't want to sound like a bit of a laundry list here, but tow truck turf wars have been going on for a couple of years now. I believe there's 4 homicides. There's been a couple arson. There's been some shootings. But despite all that violence, I think that the reason that these police officers are getting involved is because how lucrative sort of the fraud angle is. You mentioned this in your story. Can you explain how lucrative this can be for the drivers and then how the chain sort of works up and these people can make a lot of money illegally?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of money to be made in things like physiotherapy clinics, auto body shops, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of money. The tow is the least of it. And the amounts we're hearing for bribes on a tow are $400 or $500. And so that almost negates, what you'd make on the tow. But what you would make money from is a physiotherapy clinic, maybe a legal clinic, maybe auto body shop stuff, maybe car rentals. There's a lot of other places you can make money.
What type of money are we talking about? I think in your story it was like a driver can make about $2,000 for a day, but in that chain, what are we talking?
Big money like that. That's pretty good for a driver. And depending on how aggressive you are, if you're a police officer, you might handle 8 or 10 of these things a night. And so if you can make $400 or $500 per shot, you're not going to make that every night, but there's pretty good money there. There's also things like there's one police officer sold a home for a suspiciously high amount of money to someone connected to the towing business. So there's money sort of shuffling around in other ways as well. Outside of this, when you look at just the criminals, some of the charges from the York Region case involved drugs. There's other things involved. With the really heavy trucks, a lot of times the trucks are pilfered. So by the time the truck is found, it's emptied of whatever it was holding. And so that's stuff that you can put on the market. So there's quite a bit going on. And the victim is the insurance company and then you paying higher premiums. And so it's kind of a soft victim in a way.
In terms of the corruption for the police, basically they were showing favorable treatment to certain firms, right? Obviously, the dirty firms. And then where does the company Steve's Towing sort of come into all of this?
So I got a leaked memo a week ago, and the OPP has been told to stop dealing with Steve's Towing. And the person who runs Steve's Towing has actually been charged. And there are about 5 firms connected to Steve's Towing. So there's things like not just towing, but repairing cars, cleaning cars. If you're taking someone as a prisoner in the back seat, then you want the car cleaned before you put it on the road again. And so making sure there isn't COVID-19 being transmitted in a car. This Steve's business was in on that too. So there's quite a bit. There's even sort of drainage, manhole cleaning. There's quite a bit of business that's connected to a tow.
We'll be right back. Can you give us an update on Project Platinum? I think the last time we talked, you said there was about 4 sort of distinct groups that were sort of tied into that. I just want to try and get an overall picture. Like, is this Steve's Towing new? And what are the sort of factions of organized crime are we talking about here?
So Steve's isn't new, but if Steve's disappeared tomorrow, there'd still be a huge problem. Steve's is one face of what's going on, but definitely not everything. They're different turf things for different organized crime groups. And a lot of times the violence is right on the line, like right between 2 groups, and you're pushing the line over or not. So the shootings last week, there were 2 trucks parked on the 401 where basically one group wanted the line to be either respected or shifted. And so they opened fire on the other group for being where there's a unsolved murder on the East End. And that's someone who was sitting on another kind of a fault line between groups. And so there's also front companies, sort of dummy companies. So if I want to launder money, then I set up a company involved in this business. I get someone to run it. I pay that person fairly well, but then I'm making the real profit out of it. You can take this stuff pretty deep. There are reasons why they're shooting at each other, and there are real things at stake, like real money.
Do you know what these fault lines are? Where should I not be driving, basically?
Yeah. Your problem would be mainly if you had a tow truck, but there would be, if you look at the shootings last week, we had about a 6 kilometer difference between two of them, and one Avenue Road was sort of in there. Keel was kind of in there on the west end. I forget where the line is, but where one guy was shot he was sitting on the line at the time. The line might have changed a bit. There might be a bit of crossover between groups, but a lot of it is people just wanting to keep their own little area clean. And it's a nice, tidy business. If you don't have to roam all over the place, if you just stay in one little area and you've got all the business there, like if you just sew it all up.
What about Project Platinum? Do we have any updates on those cases? And also, I mean, it seemed like a high-profile bust, but from talking to you right now, it doesn't seem to have had very much of an effect.
We have also seized over $500,000 in currency and 40 firearms, including handguns, rifles, shotguns, and a machine gun. To date, this joint force investigation with our partners, the OPP, Toronto Police, and the CRA, has been very successful. We are in the process of dismantling 4 distinct criminal organizations through these arrests and those to come. With the accused facing charges and their assets seized, we expect the extreme level of violence we have seen in our community to diminish.
Yeah, big deal, but it was York Region, and things go on beyond York Region. The police involved in that, there was one really senior investigator who I'm very impressed with, who knows his stuff. And so I think Project Platinum it's one of the more interesting ones because you have some very experienced police looking at it and some very experienced criminals working in it. If this was boxing, this would be like your title match, like the best criminals against the best cops, maybe. The stuff along the 401 gets kind of grubby. Toronto Police, one of their officers was charged. They have encrypted radios, and a clone of an encrypted radio turned up in a bad guy's hands, which is questionable. You get odd allegiances and friendships too between police. Like you have one officer charged is married to a Toronto police officer, so you have a lot of crossover and bruised feelings, and so you need someone aggressive to just push the thing through. And I think York Region Project Platinum is probably the driver.
Okay, let's go back to this corruption right now, because it seems to me this is sort of where you are focusing a lot of your work and a lot of this investigation. Do you expect more charges to be coming along this line?
Definitely. I mean, if there aren't charges, there isn't an investigation. The tow truck stuff is pretty easy to get. It's kind of a so what, and if we find a tow truck driver carrying a gun, well, maybe he's afraid of another tow truck driver carrying a gun. So in a way, big deal. The bigger part for me would be just what creates this climate. How long has it gone on for? Who knew what? Steve's towing, can they prove that officers were getting favors from them? Can they prove a closer than proper relationship? The officer who's charged with accepting sexual bribery, how did that work? How do you set that one up? That points to some pretty bad stuff. I mean, there's a lot to pull on here. Also, though, it's the sort of thing that creates a real turmoil in the police community because people end up arresting their friends. And some of the officers who've been charged, you hear, aren't really bad people. They just sort of got pulled into it because other people were doing it in a moment of weakness type of thing. And if everybody else is, I don't want to stand out, which isn't an excuse. But the arrests by no means are going to end the problem. I mean, there was the 3 gun incidents immediately after the arrest last week, and 2 days after it, someone torched someone's truck. No charges in any of that stuff.
Peter, what do you think can be done about this? Let's talk about this both levels. Corruption in the police force, obviously you must weed that out. But then in terms of the industry, obviously this is something going on for years. Is more regulations necessarily on that level?
Regulation, but only if you're convinced the people doing the regulating are clean as well. I think it needs a real purging, but other places have dealt with it. I talked to someone off the record in the insurance industry who said that Toronto is one of the hot zones for North America. Like other places have dealt with this problem. The mad scramble to get to an accident first that just can't go on. I mean, it's not safe. One thing, too, I should have mentioned is that for the spillover on this, a lot of these officers who've been charged or who will be charged have other cases where they're the witness. If they get proven to be corrupt, then those cases fall out. You can't be dishonest in courtroom A and the voice of the law in courtroom B. And so some of the stunt driving, some of those other cases are sort of hanging by a thread right now. And I'm sure a lot of defense lawyers are watching which cops are dirty because that'll get their clients off.
So obviously there's going to be a domino effect from that. What about the corruption stuff with the police? I mean, basically you've got 3 already, 4 unnamed but suspended with pay. And you were saying that you expect probably the more senior officers to probably be quietly moved out, perhaps?
I don't think the quietly moved out will really work it as far as, I mean, if they're quietly moved out, then they basically get a pension, the proceeds of crime, and to walk away from it. So if you're the criminals, it's just a changing of the guard. I mean, big deal. So it's got to be something deeper than that. It's got to be, a message that this doesn't work. And it's dismantling a whole bunch of things. It's not just one thing. I mean, what about the physio clinics involved? What about the auto body shops involved? What about these yards? I mean, you hear about cars being beaten in the yards, like people take a bat to a car in a yard so that they can fix the car. It is more damage the day after the accident than in the accident. There was talk of, in Project Platinum, of people ramming cars. If there aren't enough accidents, then go create some, go ram somebody. There's a lot of work to be done here, and catching 3 constables and charging them is like taking a minnow out of the ocean, a big deal.
Peter, this is a fascinating story. What else are you looking for? What leads are you following right now?
A lot of it is trying to watch the lines, who's got what. I mean, there's Hells Angel involvement, but they're not dominant here. I mean, the odd thing is these are people, there's other people who aren't all that intimidated by them. And so there's that. There's someone who died who the circumstances of the death are still sort of up in the air, but I'm looking at that one. Definitely looking at who else is going to be charged. Way back last May, we were told that there would be 20 more charges, and so I'm waiting for those to come through. I'm waiting for charges above the level of constable.
Again, this is a fascinating story that just seems to have no end. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
I think it's more stay tuned, and that there are real victims here, and the real victim is the listener. I mean, you're paying more for insurance than you should. If you were in an ambulance on the 401 last week and there was one of these shootings, that's going to affect you when lanes are closed. If you were the victim of stunt driving and the case falls apart because the officer was dirty, you're a victim. I mean, this does affect people. It's just not as tidy of a line as we normally get.
That's an excellent point, Peter, and I'm sure we will have you on again to discuss this in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Peter Edwards is a reporter on the Crimes Court and Justice team at The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajan Budhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etizaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.